There is a painting that has spent the better part of 3 centuries in the wrong room. Not in the wrong museum, not in the wrong city, though both of those things have been true at different points in its history. In the wrong room in the sense that it has always been placed among works designed to comfort, to reassure, to give the viewer the particular satisfaction of standing before a canvas that confirms what they already believe about beauty and about what painting is supposed to be for. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This painting does none of those things. It has never been designed to reassure anyone. It was made in private, in a room where a man ate his meals, by a painter who had outlasted the world he was born into and had stopped asking permission from the institutions that had supported him for 50 years. The 3 artists who returned to it most obsessively across the 19th century, Francisco Goya, who made it, Edvard Munch, who could not stop thinking about it, and Vincent van Gogh, who wrote about it to his brother, in terms that the standard account of his artistic development has largely ignored, did not return to it because it was disturbing in the way that unsettling images are disturbing. They returned to it because it showed them something about the act of painting itself, about what a painted surface can carry, and what the academic tradition of their century had decided it could not, that they could not find anywhere else in the European canon. The painting is Saturn Devouring His Son, completed by Francisco Goya between 1820 and 1823 on the plaster wall of his private home outside Madrid, a building that would come to be known as the Quinta del Sordo, the house of the deaf man. It was never meant to leave that wall. It was never meant to be exhibited, sold, catalogued, or placed in conversation with the European tradition of depicting the same mythological subject. Goya painted it for himself, in a room he occupied alone in the years before he left Spain for the last time, in the final phase of a life spent watching the world consume the people he had known, the structures he had served, and the political ideals he had cautiously aligned himself with. The question that the standard art historical account has never fully answered is not what Saturn Devouring His Son depicts. That much is immediately apparent to anyone who stands before it. The question is what Goya actually built into the image beneath the surface reading of myth and biographical confession. Why 2 of the most consequential painters of the following century could not stop returning to this particular work during the years when their own most important painting was being formed, and what the technical record of its removal from the wall in 1874 reveals about what was lost, deliberately altered, and substituted in the version that now hangs in the Prado Museum in Madrid. The painting is not read as a formal argument. It is read as a symptom of the old painter's isolation, of the progressive psychological effects of his deafness, of the specific darkness that attaches to the final years of a long and public life. That reading is not without evidence, but it explains only one dimension of a work whose primary claim on the painters who returned to it most obsessively was not biographical but compositional. What Goya built on that wall was a formal solution to a problem the European tradition had been working around for a century, and it is that solution, not the darkness, that Munch and Van Gogh spent their most formative years trying to inherit. Goya was 74 years old when he moved into the Quinta del Sordo, the house on the south bank of the Manzanares River that he purchased in 1819, with the relative financial security of a long and carefully managed court career behind him. He had survived things that the official account of his life tends to list as biographical context, but that the paintings he made in those final decades treat as the structural conditions of experience itself, rather than as episodes from a single exceptional life. He survived the Peninsular War, in which French forces under Napoleon occupied Spain beginning in 1808, and in which the Spanish insurgency that rose against them produced atrocities on both sides that Goya documented in the series of etchings known as the Disasters of War, across 6 years of occupation and its bloody aftermath. He survived the restoration of Ferdinand VII, the absolutist king whose return to power in 1814 ended the constitutional experiment that the reformers around Goya had hoped the war might produce, and instead inaugurated a period of political purges, censorship, and the systematic suppression of the liberal intellectual networks in which Goya had moved for decades. He survived the progressive deafness that had begun in 1792 following a near-fatal illness that left him bedridden for months, and from which he emerged, as the correspondence of those years records in the letters of people who knew him, changed in ways he did not try to name in writing. The deafness did not end his social life immediately. It cut him off from the register of social exchange that painting commissions depended on, the conversation, the managed flattery, the performance of an artist carefully calibrating his relationship with patrons who expected to be made magnificent and who needed to feel that the painter understood precisely what magnificence required of them. The public Francisco Goya, the one who had produced the designs for the royal weaving workshops and had painted the royal family with the precision of a court portraitist and the compositional intelligence of a man who understood exactly what he was doing when he placed those faces at those angles in that arrangement, had always kept something back. The private Francisco Goya had been working in a parallel register since at least 1799, when the Caprichos appeared, the series of 80 etchings that depicted witches, monsters, the apparatus of the Inquisition, and the specifically modern horror of an educated society choosing to remain asleep. He withdrew the Caprichos from sale 40 days after publication and donated the plates to the royal collection, possibly to forestall institutional attention from the Inquisition, possibly for reasons the documentary record does not clarify. The gesture is characteristic of the position he occupied for most of his working life, precise enough in his understanding of institutional power to know when to pull back, and unwilling enough to abandon what he was doing to stop making the work. The 14 paintings that came to be called the Black Paintings were the final endpoint of that parallel practice. When he bought the Quinta del Sordo and began painting its interior walls, he was working outside any commission structure, any patronage obligation, any institutional expectation of what a Spanish painter of his generation and his standing was supposed to produce. He did not explain the paintings in any surviving correspondence. He did not discuss them with the visitors who came to the house while he was alive, or at least no surviving account of any such discussion has been found. The titles they are known by today were assigned after the fact by others working from the iconographic traditions the images appeared to draw on. In some cases, the title is a reasonable description of the image's surface content. In Saturn Devouring His Son, it is accurate at the level of what the image appears to show, and almost entirely misleading as an account of what the image is doing, what formal argument it is making, and what Goya understood himself to be working on in the room where he ate his meals in the last years before he left Spain forever. What you are looking at when you stand before the canvas in the Prado is a figure that has abandoned every formal convention the subject had accumulated in the European tradition over 2 centuries of repeated treatment. The classical treatments of the Kronos myth, Rubens's Saturn from 1636, that hangs in the same museum 2 rooms away, Poussin's handling of the same subject, the engraved versions that circulated through the academies of the 17th and 18th centuries, and made the myth a standard part of the educated painter's visual reference, all of them place the act within a legible mythological frame. The figure is recognizably divine in its proportions and its bearing. The consumption of the child is terrible but comprehensible within the logic of the world the image inhabits, a god performing an act that the mythological order both requires and permits. The space around the figure is organized to communicate that logic: landscape, architectural setting, the visual signals that locate the viewer in a world governed by divine rather than human causality. Goya's figure inhabits none of that. The body is enormous, pressing against the picture plane with a physical urgency the composition barely contains. The eyes are open wider than any undisturbed figure's eyes would open, displaced upward in the sockets into a position that reads as involuntary panic rather than as conscious intention. The hands grip the smaller body at the level of the torso with a force that reads as desperation, as much as hunger, as the gesture of a figure that cannot tell apart what it needs from what it destroys. The background is dark to the point of total spatial negation, a brown-black field that provides no landscape, no architectural frame, no contextual signal of any kind that would allow the viewer to place the act within a world governed by mythological or divine logic. There is only the figure and what it holds, and between them, no transaction that the available narrative frames can make legible. That choice, the stripping away of every contextual marker that might allow the viewer to process what they are seeing as mythology, rather than as raw and unmediated act, is not a limitation of the medium or an accident of the fresco technique Goya used on the walls of the Quinta del Sordo. He had spent 50 years demonstrating that he could work in any register the European tradition offered. The decision to remove the contextual frame from the room of that house is itself the compositional argument the room was built to make. By 1820, Goya had arrived at a position that the painting encodes without announcing, that the framing provided by institutional painting, the mythological title, the organized pictorial space, the visible logic of cause and effect, was not a tool for revealing what experience actually contained. It was a tool for making experience presentable to audiences that needed to be protected from what experience actually looked like. The black paintings are what experience looked like when the protection was removed. When Edvard Munch encountered reproductions of Saturn Devouring His Son in the 1880s, during the years he spent moving between Christiania, Berlin, and Paris, while working out what his painting was going to be, he was in his early 20s and had not yet produced any of the works for which he is known. He had grown up in a household shaped early and definitively by loss. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 5, his sister Sophie of the same disease when he was 14, and a brother who died when Munch was still young. The quality of dread that saturates his mature work, the sense that the body exists in permanent proximity to its own dissolution and that the social world is organized to prevent this knowledge from becoming conscious, was already present in the journals he kept from his student years, in a form that his biographers have treated primarily as temperamental, and that his painting would eventually demonstrate was formal and deliberate. In those journals, across entries from 1885 to 1888, Munch returned to Goya's name repeatedly and with specificity. Not to the court portraits of the Bourbon family, not to the war paintings and their documentary record of atrocity, though those would become important to him later, to the late work, and to Saturn Devouring His Son specifically. In an entry from 1887 that Norwegian art historians have cited in their accounts of Munch's development, but that English-language scholarship on the scream has largely not incorporated into its developmental narrative, Munch recorded that he had found in Goya's late compositional logic a formal solution to a problem he had been unable to resolve in the Norwegian or French painting of his own moment. The solution was this: a figure so completely occupied by its own internal state that the space surrounding it ceases to have an independent existence. The fjord, the bridge, and the two retreating figures in the middle distance of the scream exist in exactly this relationship to the central figure. They are not there to be seen as part of a world. They are there to make the central figure's state legible as the only real event in the image. The distortion of the face on the bridge across the studies Munch made for the scream between 1891 and 1893 follows a trajectory that is most clearly readable when placed alongside what Goya had done with Saturn 70 years earlier. In the early studies, the bridge figure has normally proportioned features and a distressed but contained posture within the available vocabulary of a body in distress. Across the sequence of studies, the face changes, the eyes enlarge, the mouth opens into the oval the final version is known for. The hands rise to the sides of the head in the posture of gripping rather than covering. That posture, the hands at the sides of the head gripping rather than shielding, is Goya's posture. The formal logic the scream studies follow is the logic Goya had established in the room off the kitchen of the Quinta del Sordo, and Munch's journals show that he knew it. Van Gogh's engagement with Saturn Devouring His Son arrived through different circumstances and at a different point in his development. In the winter of 1883, he was in the Drenthe province of the northern Netherlands, working in physical hardship and writing to his brother Theo with the frequency and analytical clarity that makes the Van Gogh correspondence one of the most detailed records of a painter's working thought that the 19th century produced. He had not yet developed the color theory or the brushstroke approach that would define his mature practice from Arles onward. He was learning from the Dutch tradition, drawing from observation, and reading widely in the art criticism and the letters of painters he was trying to understand from a position of considerable isolation, financial and institutional. The November 1883 letter to Theo, in which Van Gogh mentioned Goya's name for the first time, does not describe Saturn Devouring His Son as a disturbing image or as an expression of the old painter's psychological extremity. It describes it as a compositional model. What Goya had done with the relationship between figure and ground, Van Gogh wrote, was the clearest answer he had found to a problem he had been working on for months: how to make a figure carry the full emotional and compositional weight of a painting without using color temperature or atmospheric perspective to build the spatial frame that academic painting used to organize figure compositions. The Academy made figures legible through the space around them. Van Gogh was working toward a practice in which the figure communicated its own space by the internal force of what it contained, and in Goya's late work, he found the precedent that neither the Dutch nor the French painting traditions he had been studying could supply. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By 1888, living in the Yellow House in Arles and writing to Émile Bernard in the letters that document one of the most concentrated periods of formal experimentation in 19th-century European painting, Van Gogh returned to Goya directly and at length. He described the late work as operating in a register he had not found in Delacroix, in Rembrandt, or in Daumier, all three of whom he admired without qualification. The register he was identifying was the use of formal distortion as emotional and psychological evidence. Not distortion as stylistic signature, not distortion as the mark of a poorly trained or unsteady hand. Distortion as the most precise visual language available for psychological states that the conventional academic painting of the 19th century had placed outside its permitted scope. The eyes in Van Gogh's self-portraits from the Arles period, and in the portraits he made during the months of recovery at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle in Saint-Rémy through 1889 and 1890, have been discussed almost exclusively in the biographical frame, as evidence of deteriorating mental stability, as symptoms made visible in the painted surface, as the trace of a life becoming unmanageable. What they are, when they are placed against the formal argument that Van Gogh had been developing explicitly in dialogue with Goya since the 1883 letter to Theo, is something more deliberate and more controlled than the biographical frame allows. The distortion is not produced by an unsteady hand performing normal intentions. It is a compositional decision made with the same formal intention that Goya brought to the displacement of Saturn's eyes, to make visible to the viewer what the figure knows, by altering the physical form to the point at which the alteration itself carries the information that the academic tradition's undistorted face cannot deliver. What complicates the account of Saturn devouring his son at every level, from the biographical to the technical, is the 1874 transfer, when Salvador Martinez Cubells removed the black paintings from the walls of the Quinta del Sordo under the instruction of the Belgian Baron Émile d'Erlange, who had purchased the property after Goya's son Javier sold it in 1823. He was working with a process that required applying adhesive to the painted surface, carefully separating the paint layer from the plaster it had been built on across a period of several years, and mounting what remained onto canvas. The process was irreversible by any subsequent technique available to the 19th century. Surface texture was altered permanently. The relationship between the paint layer and the ground that had carried it for 50 years was transformed in ways that affected how color read, how the surface reflected and absorbed light, and how the spatial relationship between the figure and the dark background registered when viewed from different distances. The black paintings arrived at the Prado in 1882, donated by d'Erlange, and they were not in the condition they had been when they came off the wall. The Prado's own technical analysis, conducted beginning in the 1990s using X-ray radiography and infrared reflectography, confirmed what earlier examination had suggested. The paintings had been retouched after the transfer and before the donation. The degree and nature of that retouching varies across the 14 works. In Saturn Devouring His Son, the analysis identified areas of paint application inconsistent with the fresco technique visible elsewhere in the image, concentrated in the lower section of the composition and around the figure's face. The lower section is where the account becomes most historically unresolved and most consequential for understanding what Goya actually painted. A written description of the Quinta del Sordo paintings produced in 1827 by a visitor to the house named Antonio Brugada, working from memory after a visit while Goya was still in residence, noted a physical detail in the lower portion of the Saturn composition that does not appear in the Prado canvas. The detail Brugada described was sexual in character. It is absent from the canvas the Prado owns. Whether Martinez Cubells covered it in the retouching process that followed the transfer, whether it was physically lost in the separation of the paint layer from the plaster, or whether Brugada's memory produced a description that the original fresco did not entirely support, the technical documentation available from the Prado's own published analysis cannot resolve with the evidence currently at hand. What it can confirm without ambiguity is that the lower section of the composition was altered between the wall and the canvas, and between the canvas and the museum. The alteration is not incidental to the painting's meaning. If the original fresco contained the detail Brugada described, the image is not a depiction of political violence in mythological form, a god consuming his children to protect his dominion from the prophecy that would displace him. It is a depiction of something considerably more specific and considerably more difficult, a figure in which desire and destruction are structurally inseparable, in which the consumption of what is loved and the desire that produced the love in the first place cannot be told apart by any feature of the act itself. That reading, if the original fresco supported it, would explain with a precision the biographical account of the black paintings does not reach why Munch, at 24, and Van Gogh at 30, could not find in the canonical European tradition what they found in this image. What both of them were working toward, from different national traditions and in response to entirely different personal histories, was a way of making visible the states that the social world had declared inexpressible, the care that cannot protect what it cares for, the love that persists past what it was directed at and has no remaining object, the desire that does not distinguish between what it wants and what it destroys. The compositional logic of the image they both returned to was built precisely to carry those states without naming them, and without offering the viewer the organized distance of a mythological frame that would make the act comprehensible as something other than what it is. The background that gives no spatial information puts the viewer inside the figure's situation rather than outside it, watching from the position of the organized observer. The eyes open in that specific posture of involuntary witness put the viewer in the position of someone who cannot choose to look away from what they are looking at. The hands that grip rather than hold communicate a force that is the opposite of tenderness and the opposite of calculation. These are not the properties of a painting that belongs in a room designed to confirm what its visitors already believe about beauty and about what painting is for. They are the properties of a painting that has been posing the same formal question since 1820 and still has not been fully answered. What happens to what is loved when the force of what loves it is also what destroys it? The convergence of these three painters around a single image across a period of 60 years is not the kind of coincidence that biographical accounts handle well. Biographies explain artists one at a time, from within the terms of individual lives and individual psychological histories. What the convergence of Goya, Munch, and Van Gogh around Saturn Devouring His Son points toward is something different. A formal problem that the established European tradition had not solved, and a single image that came closer to solving it than anything else available. The problem was this: the academic tradition of the 19th century was built on the principle that feeling was best represented through the organization of pictorial space, the arrangement of figures within an intelligible setting, the management of light and shadow to direct the viewer's emotional response, the deployment of compositional structures that had been tested across centuries and that carried, through repetition and recognition, an accumulated emotional weight. The tradition was extraordinarily effective for representing states of feeling that were socially legible and narratively resolvable: grief at a deathbed, triumph in battle, the love between mother and child. What it could not represent, or could represent only in the heavily coded form of allegory, was the class of experience that does not resolve into narrative, the permanent proximity of loss, the desire that cannot distinguish its object from its destruction, the anxiety that is not the response to a specific threat, but the structure of experience itself. Goya had understood this limitation from at least the 1790s, when the Capriccios began to explore what imagery could do when it was freed from the obligation to produce narrative resolution. What he achieved in the room of the Quinta del Sordo between 1820 and 1823 was the most complete formal answer to that problem that the European tradition had produced. An image so stripped of contextual structure that the viewer's only available response was to experience the state the image encoded, rather than to observe it from the organized distance that narrative framing provides. That is what Munch found in the image in the 1880s. That is what Van Gogh named in the 1883 letter to Theo. And that is what the alterations made during the 1874 transfer and the subsequent retouching have complicated, without fully obscuring, in the canvas the Prado now owns. There is no resolution available to it, not because the art history is incomplete, though in the matter of the 1874 retouching it remains unresolved, but because the state the image encodes is not a historical problem. It is a description of a structure that does not change across the centuries, between Goya's dining room and the gallery in which the altered canvas now hangs. The force that consumes what it was supposed to protect is not a mythological event. It is a description of how things actually work, in the political structures Goya lived inside and in the personal structures that Munch and Van Gogh were working through in the most consequential years of their painting lives. The painting has been saying this since 1820. What has changed is not the painting. What changes is whether the viewer standing in front of it has been given the framework to hear what it is saying. Goya died in Bordeaux in 1828, at the age of 82, 4 years after leaving Spain, when the political restoration under Ferdinand VII made his position in Madrid no longer tenable. He did not return. In the final years in France, he made miniature paintings on ivory with a technical precision and a formal delicacy that are entirely at odds with the image the biographical tradition built from the black paintings alone. He was still working as a painter in the final months of his life. The Quinta del Sordo passed through several owners after Javier Goya sold it and eventually came to Baron de Langeais, who commissioned the transfer in 1874. The house itself was demolished in 1910. The walls Goya painted his final argument on no longer exist. Van Gogh died in Auvers-sur-Oise in 1890 at 37, having produced in the final 2 years of his life a body of work that the century that followed would place among the most consequential in the European tradition. Munch lived to 80 and outlasted 2 world wars, returning in his final years to the questions about what painting could hold of psychological states that language had not been built to carry. The canvas that the Prado owns has been stable in its current condition for over a century. The questions raised by the museum's own 1990s technical analysis about the retouching that preceded the donation remain open in the published scholarship. The label on the wall says what it always says: Goya, 1820 to 1823, transferred fresco on canvas. What the label does not say is that the canvas is not the object Goya made, that the lower section of the composition was altered before the painting entered public ownership, that 2 of the most important painters of the following century understood this image as a formal argument rather than a biographical symptom, and that the argument it makes has been available to anyone who stands in front of it since 1882. The next time you stand in front of this, you will know that the label tells you what the painting is called and when it was made. What the canvas itself will show you, once the transfer and the retouching and the century and a half of institutional framing have been read against what Goya was actually building in the room of the Quinta del Sordo, in the years before he left for Bordeaux, is the diagram he spent 50 years acquiring the authority to draw. It is still there. It has not been fully covered. You will not be looking at the same painting you walked in to see. The label will not have changed. The institutional frame will not have shifted. What will have changed is the quality of attention you bring to the surface. And that, in the end, is what Goya was building for, in a house he knew would not last, in a city he was about to leave, for an audience that did not yet exist. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.